evening we are going to go on with our study of positional chess. Now what many people don't realize is that part and parcel of positional chess is how to create weaknesses in the opponent's castle position. If we look at this position on the board and black's castle position, we notice that this is an absolutely normal position. Why? Because not one pawn has moved. The knight is on the square it originally comes out to in the game. The king has castled. If the knight is pushed away, we call that a temporary weakness. Or if the rook has been pushed away, we call that a temporary weakness. Temporary because it could be that the knight can get back there. But if in the course of a game a pawn is moved, any pawn, then that is called a permanent weakness. When this g-pawn is moved, the black squares become very weak. Notice here, this pawn protects those black squares. That weakens them. This pawn weakens the king position, it becomes a target. We advance a pawn on this file, we eventually exchange it off, and we open up the king position. So one of the main positional threats in the mid-game is how are you going to try and weaken the opponent's castle position. Now once you do weaken it, either by a temporary or a permanent weakness, then you have at your disposal certain typical attacks which you can learn. There are about 18 to 20 typical attacks. Most of them have their names based upon the originators of these attacks in some early games played in chess history. Now, in a position like this, with a normal position, even with a normal position, and with white having at his disposal a queen, a rook, and a bishop on the squares in which we find them now. Now, you must realize that the positions I'm going to show you tonight are what we call skeletal positions. You can imagine all sorts of pieces on the board, but the basic components of the position are the pieces on the squares in which we find them right now. This is a skeletal position for a specific attack. In this position, white can win on the move in 1, 2, 3 moves. White has a checkmate in 3 moves, and it's white to move. Now, when I say white to move and mate in 3, it means white moves, then no matter what black does, white can force checkmate in 2 more moves. That's white to move and mate in 3. I'm going to let you watch this, try and study it for a while, see if you can come up with a solution. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of these this evening. It's like a little quiz. But what I want you to get out of this quiz is the fact that any weakening of the castle position can be a tragic weakening on the opponent's side if you know how to take advantage of it. This is called Morphy's attack. And what we do is give up our queen. We go queen takes knight. Now the bishop and the queen are attacking here, threatening checkmate. So black has no alternative but to take the queen. It's a queen sacrifice. And then we have a check on the open file. The king is forced over here. The bishop comes up, takes this pawn, checkmate. The king cannot come back because of the rook, and so we have a checkmate. Let's look at that again and study it. This queen can be anywhere, but this is even an attack on a normal castle position. Queen takes knight, threatening checkmate, backed up by the bishop on the long diagonal. The queen has to be taken. So we have a position like this. Check, the king moves over, and then the bishop comes in with the checkmate like that. Let's look over at the other board. We'll see another situation. This is a situation in which there are 2 temporary weaknesses. I say temporary because no pawn has moved, but the knight is missing, and the rook has moved over, and the king has moved over. The question now, the queen and rook, white's queen and rook are doubled on the king file. How can they provide checkmate? The question here is white to move and mate in 1, 2, 3 moves. White to move and mate in 3. And while you study this, I'll set up another position on the other board, but you keep studying this. White to move and mate in 3. See what you can come up with. It'd be nice to have some music by now, but I'll keep talking. Okay. Are you ready? Then let's see if you found it. The queen moves up so far and says check. Notice the king cannot take because he cannot move into check. The rook is protecting it. The king has to move in a square, his only move. Then the queen gives up herself, check. The rook is forced to take. Rook takes rook. And that is what's known classically as our corridor mate. The king cannot get out. The rook says check, corridor mate. Look at it again. Notice if the king were already in here, this would be a mate immediately. It would be a mate immediately. But because the king is protecting this square also, the king gets first kicked into the corridor, followed by the checkmate. Now let's look over at our other board, and we have another interesting situation. Here, we have a permanent weakness and a temporary weakness. The knight is missing, a pawn is missing. A drastic position for black. In this position, what can we do for black? Let's see if I have the right position. That's right. This king is over here. Make it easier. In this position, we have a mate. White to move, and white checkmates in 1, 2, 3 moves. White to move and checkmate in 3 moves. Now study that for a moment. White to move and checkmate in 3 moves. You found it yet? Let's see. First, the check. Rook over, check. The king moves. Now, a lot of beginners would simply say, hooray, I won a rook. Bishop takes rook. Even though bishop takes bishop, a rook is stronger. But a more experienced player would see that it's a checkmate. Check. The king cannot take because of this rook. The king is forced over here. And now the bishop comes up here. Exposed or discovered check. Remember one of our tactical themes? Check. And the king cannot get out because of the bishop. A nice little checkmate. Something repetitive of the first theme we saw of the Morphy mate. Now let's look at this position on our other board. What are our weaknesses? This is what we have to first consider. Now I must remind you that when you're playing a game of chess and your opponent has a castle position, you want to create a weakness, either temporary or permanent, in that castle position and then go on the attack, knowing some attacks like these. The pawn has moved in front of the castle king. Always very dangerous. The knight is missing, the black knight. So white has a checkmate here in 1, 2, 3 moves. Again, white moves and mates in 3. And by now I expect you to be able to see the solutions. Study it. White to move, and regardless what black does, it's a mate in 3. White to move and mate in 3. You got it? Let's see. Well, we'll start with the check. Okay? We notice that this diagonal is covered by this bishop. So we simply give up our bishop. Always remember, when the castle king is in such a weak position, and if you have more on the offense than the opponent has on the defense, think in terms of sacrificing the piece, and in order to get into that ripped up situation. Bishop takes pawn, check. The king cannot move. The black squares are covered. Forces, king takes bishop. Now the queen comes up with a check. The king has to move here, the only square left. And we have Anderson's mate, it's called, after Adolf Anderson of the 19th century, and that's checkmate. The king cannot take because it's protected by the bishop. Checkmate. Okay? Let's look at this other situation. The more and more of these you look at, the more you should be able to catch on to them. Here is a position also with a permanent weakness. A center G pawn is missing. The knight is missing. The rook's not in its proper square. A lot of weaknesses. Something should definitely happen. White to move and mate in 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 moves. It's all forced. 1, 2, 3, 4. I had to make sure myself. Check it out, study it, see what you come up with. And I'll set up another one. Now, is your first move going to be queen takes pawn or bishop takes pawn? What do you think? Here I am back. Well, queen takes pawn with a check looks good. But the king can actually escape. There's no forced mate. But if you take with bishop takes pawn, the king cannot move out because of the queen. King cannot take the bishop because of the queen. The king is forced into the corner. Now watch this. Bishop moves here. Looks dangerous, doesn't it, because the pawn takes bishop. But that is a discovered check with the queen. So the king must move. There's no chance of this being taken. The king must move. Check. The king has only one move. The queen comes in, says check. Protected by the bishop. The king has one move. The queen comes over, checkmate. The king cannot take the queen, protected by the bishop, and there we have a checkmate. You see how easy it is? Now remember, I said again, there can be a lot of pieces on the board, but this is the essence of the position, the skeletal essence of the position. If you have a weakness in the opponent's position, think of these specific attacks, learn these specific, what we call typical mates, and they're great tactical and positional threats to use in the middle game. Let's look at another one. In this position, the rook pawn is missing. The G pawn has moved forward. The weakness is not that weak in that there's a bishop to cover the black squares. But because of the lack of the rook pawn and the fact that the knight is missing, there are, as we know, weaknesses in the castle position. It's white to move, and you should get this by now very easily. White to move and mate in 1, 2 moves. 2 moves. You should find that easily, and I'll set up another one while you're figuring it out. This next one will really tax you. 2 moves. How many of you got it? I can hear you all arguing at home as to what the right move is. Well, you should know it. Okay, rook straight down. Check. Some people wouldn't think of doing that because it gives up a rook. Bishop takes rook. But of course, rook takes bishop. Checkmate, another Anderson mate. Checkmate. Sure, it's becoming easy now. The more of these you see and the more you practice them at home, the more obvious it becomes. And that's the charm of this chess when you're learning it. What seems to be incredible when you first see it becomes old hat after a while. And it actually makes the game of chess simpler for you. You get into the middle game. You force a weakness in the opponent's castle-king position. And right away, depending on what's moved, what pawn or what knight, you have narrowed down to certain attacks. And the threat of these attacks, you may not carry the attack out, but the threat of the attack is often better than its execution. Because by trying to avert the threat, you're forcing the opponent into maybe a position that is uncomfortable for him. Let's look at one more. These are a lot of fun. This is really nice. The king is really in a sorry state. Look, right down into the corner. He's been pushed over. The knight has been pushed back in here. This pawn is missing. So there are both temporary and permanent weaknesses. But notice that white has only really two pieces at his disposal. Let's put a prettier queen on. One with a full crown. Okay? Only a knight and a queen. And the knight cannot move. Why cannot the knight move? Because of the check. So the knight is pinned to that square because as long as the queen is there, because of the check. But there is a forced mate by white. There's a forced mate in one, do you see it? 2 moves. White can actually win in 2 moves. Now, how is white going to win when this knight is actually pinned? A win in 2 moves. White to move, then black moves, then checkmate by white. Now, see if you can see it. It's a really nice one. And you should really be able to solve that. Ready? Here I am back. Now naturally the knight can't move. The knight can't move because of the check. How many of you saw this? Queen takes pawn. Check. Now, the king cannot take the queen because of the knight. So that forces queen takes queen. Now, there is no pin. The queen has been taken off. There is no pin. And we have what's called a smothered mate. Checkmate. The king cannot get out. Let's look at that again. That's so pretty. There it is. White to move and mate in 2. Give up the queen. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes. Knight in. Smothered mate. Beautiful. Another position. Very common in a chess game. What is the weakness in the camp? The knight is missing. So there's a temporary weakness. No weaknesses yet in the pawn structure. But white can cause a weakness in the pawn structure which will follow by mate. So it's white to move. And in 1, 2, 3 moves is checkmate. Look it over. As when this pawn gets up to the 5th rank and you have a queen here and the knight is missing and you have a pawn structure like that, you're able to win the game. Look carefully at it and study it, and I'll give you another problem to solve on the other board. And while you're studying that, this other one will be a queenside castling problem, just to test your mettle. Most chess players really get a kick out of going over these typical mates. It's the slam-bang style of chess. It's the type of chess you like to play in fast blitz games. How can we disrupt the pawn structure? Obviously, we move the pawn to bishop 6. This pawn cannot take it because of the check. And immediately, white is threatening checkmate. The only way to stop checkmate in this position is to advance this pawn. The only way to stop it. But that creates weaknesses over here. So after the queen moves in here, it doesn't matter what black does, because this is checkmate next. King cannot take because the pawn takes diagonally, remember? Checkmate. Let's look at the original position. It happens in an awful lot of games when this f-pawn is advanced to the 5th. And you can push that pawn away, the knight away that was originally there. You push this pawn. You provoke a permanent weakness, take advantage of the black squares and sneak in. You can even do it in some positions if you have a bishop way over there. It's the same idea, isn't it? Taking advantage of the long diagonal. Okay, let's look over in this board. We have a position where black has castled queenside. Queenside castling. And he's got his rooks doubled. The only weakness here is that this pawn has been pushed. And that pawn is very often pushed in queenside openings. What has white got at his disposal? He's got a rook, a queen, and a bishop. Again, there may be other pieces on the board. This is the skeletal position, the essence of the attack. If you have this set up, you're ready to zero in. So it's white to move and mate in 1-2 moves. Believe it or not, in 2 moves there's a checkmate. Find it. Dare you. I'll set up another nice one. They should be coming easier to you. I think one thing you're noticing in all of these, and what you're looking for, is some sort of flashy sacrifice. This is one reason I've selected these positions, because I want you to realize that sacrifices are order of the day when you want to smash your way into the enemy's camp. Have you found it? This pawn, having moved, gives black this complete diagonal. Now, wouldn't it be nice if this rook could be here? That would be a checkmate, wouldn't it? The king cannot move out, cannot take the rook because of the bishop. Well, that would be very nice. So the question is, how are we going to get rid of this pawn so the rook can come down? Well, the way we get rid of it is by a queen sacrifice. Don't we love these queen sacrifices? Don't sacrifice your queen, though, unless you really see a checkmate coming. I'm just showing you this so that you get in the habit of at least looking. At least looking. There's an old joke in chess. They say, always say check, it might be mate, even if you don't see it. But think twice before you sacrifice. In this case, you should have seen. If you sacrifice the queen, take that pawn, you say check. If the rook comes over to prevent, you simply take it and you say checkmate, protected by the bishop. If the rook does not come over, the only other choice, the king cannot get out because of this bishop. The only other thing is the pawn comes over to take the queen, and we have our checkmate that we hope for. That's known as Boden's mate, named after a chess player by the name of Boden. And it usually happens on the queen side, with this bishop pawn having moved. Boden's mate. These are a lot of fun. I know if you're watching at home and trying to figure out, you're enjoying it. Look at this sorry position. What's left of the castle king position? The knight is gone, the rook is gone, even the pawns are gone. The only thing protecting the king is a bishop, and I suppose the queen is backing up the bishop. So how is white going to penetrate and get a checkmate here? Well, there is one. There's a checkmate in 1, 2, 3 moves. White has a checkmate in 3 moves. And I have about a minute to show you one more. You look that one over carefully, and I'll show you another one. White has a checkmate in 3 moves. White has a checkmate in 3 moves. Here we go. Are we ready? Check. King cannot come out because of the pawn. The king cannot take because of the queen. So, the bishop is forced to take. But the bishop has left this square empty. And the queen has a lovely road to come in and say, check. Checkmate. That's removal of the guard. Remember that tactic? Removal of the guard. You give up a piece, remove the guard, the queen slips in, comes over for checkmate. Here's our last one. Look over here, folks. We have a castle position with the king moved over there. The rook pawn is missing. A pawn has reached f6, covering the black square. We have at our disposal a rook and a queen. How are we going to get checkmate? Look quickly, because we're running out of time. How are we going to get a checkmate out of this? I'm going to make it harder. There. Make it harder. Okay, the queen comes up. Queen comes up. Threatening checkmate in here. The rook is forced over to stop the queen from coming in, but the queen gives herself up anyway. Check. The king is forced to take. Poor king. Forced to take, and the rook slides over. Checkmate. And there we have it. And I hope you enjoyed these typical mates. Remember them. There's a lot more to study, and you can get more out of your books. You can get more by writing me. You can get more by coming to the chess club. And remember, we have a postal box that you can send letters to. It's box 7025, St. John. Play chess. Thanks for watching.